Hi there, and welcome to a new episode of Impact Talks. Today we have Aziz Abu Sara with us. He's an explorer at National Geographic as well as an entrepreneur in the Middle East. He has a very interesting story that is very relevant to any entrepreneurs or startups out there. He's a peace builder, and I'm very excited to have him on. Please, Aziz, introduce yourself. Where might the people know you from?
All right. Thank you so much. My name is Aziz Abu Sara. As you said, I'm from Jerusalem. That's where I grew up. I'm Palestinian. And I've been doing kind of mix of work between conflict resolution, peace building, and entrepreneurship in the Middle East, but also in other countries outside the Middle East. And my goal really is, or my mission in my work is really to just find ways to put cracks in walls that divide us. I focus on creating meaning connections and do it in any way possible, whether it's through normal conflict resolution avenues, negotiations, peace building projects, or through business entrepreneurship ideas. So that's what I focus on.
I first got introduced to your work. I read what you wrote on the National Geographic website, how it all started and how you introduced business. I loved, we obviously had a conversation before this, how you used the medium of entrepreneurship. I think your partner is Jewish as well, to really start introducing peace building for a conversation that seems almost lost because it's been happening for so long and people are desperate for peace. I want to, however, start from the beginning. You have a very interesting story. You probably have told it 100 times. Can you give a brief version for the people who don't know about it yet?
So yeah, my story is an example of how you can't think if somebody grew up on the other side of peace building, they can't come around, because that's where I grew up. And as I said, I grew up in Jerusalem. I grew up in the first Intifada time, the first Palestinian uprising. I was a little kid, maybe 6, 7 years old when it started. And my neighborhood literally had nothing. We had not a one playground. We didn't have any community centers. We didn't have anything. I walked to school, which was about a mile and a half from my house. And that was our normal day-to-day life. And when the Intifada, the uprising started, I watched on TV people throwing rocks. And I thought, this is a fun thing to do. Finally, there's something to do. How could I not have thought about this? That's what goes on in the mind of a 7-year-old. I didn't know anything about Israelis, Palestinians, the conflict. You're 6 or 7, you don't know any of that. And so we went out to throw rocks, and instead of throwing rocks at Israelis, because we didn't know the difference, we threw rocks at our neighbors, me and my other friends who were 6 and 7 years old. And the problem with throwing rocks at your neighbors, they actually know where you live. So they showed up and told my parents, and we got disciplined, but didn't stop us. Eventually, we figured out there are settlers, Jewish Israeli settlers living close to where we are, start throwing rocks on that road. And at some point, we hit a bus. Didn't make any damage, but we hit a bus, and somebody came out and started shooting at us. And that was my first real introduction to Israeli-Palestinian conflict in some ways. Being shot at when you are 7 or so years old is terrifying, but you also think you are invincible. And as time passed, more and more of these stories started happening. Few months later, I remember going back home and telling my mother, I don't want to go to school anymore. And she said, like any mother, you can't not go to school. What do you mean you're going to quit school? I'm like, it's not worth it. I don't think I should die for education. There were tear gas shot at us today, and I'm not going to go to suffocate on the way to school. And my mom had to come up with a way to help me overcome my fear of going to school. And the way she did it, she gave me an onion and said, if you see tear gas, you cut this onion and you put it close to your nose, and it'll help you not suffocate. And I grew up honestly thinking everybody in the world goes to school with an onion. Just so many of these kind of stories. Eventually, a year later, my brother was arrested from my home At like 5 in the morning, he was taken to interrogation. He was beaten up through this interrogation by Israeli soldiers. And when he was released from prison, he had internal injuries, which after surgery, he ended up dying as a result of those injuries. He was 19 years old when that happened. I was 10 at that point, and I was devastated. I was angry. I was bitter. I felt like revenge is the only direction at that point. If somebody kills your brother, then your only choice is to fight back, is to do something about it. And for the next 8 years, that was my life. It was focused on revenge. It was focused on anger. I became very active politically. I started writing a lot. I edited a youth magazine and was very angry stuff. I mobilized people to protest. And it's not always the actions, it's the motivation behind that action. Through that whole time, I must say, I was convinced what I was doing was justice. And it took me years later to understand that the line between justice and revenge, it's a very, very thin line. We all convinced what we do is justice, yet I believe many of us are actually out for revenge, not for justice. And I was one of those people. And I did that until I was 18 years old, when I realized I needed to study Hebrew. And I went to study Hebrew in a place called Ulpan.
Wait, quick question to interrupt there, because in your written letter that you had on the National Geographic website, you also mentioned this. But what was the reason that you needed to learn Hebrew? What was the purpose for that?
So in Jerusalem, if you don't speak Hebrew, your life is pretty much going to be over from a professional point of view. You're not going to get really a good job. You're not going to get good education. Hebrew is very important in Jerusalem. And it was mandatory in my high school, but I managed to go through 3 years without learning a word of Hebrew, because to me it was the language of the enemy and I'm not willing to learn it. And that's how far anti anything to do with Israelis and Palestinians I was. I'm not willing to even learn the language. That was my stand. And when I finished high school, I realized I'm in trouble. If I don't learn Hebrew, my life is over. I'm not going to ever get a good job. I'm not going to get a good education. And so I looked at the best place to learn Hebrew, and it was in West Jerusalem. And it was in an Israeli institute where mostly Israeli immigrants or Jewish immigrants go to learn there. And I swallowed my pride and decided, if this is the best place, this is where I should go. And I remember my first day there, I arrived and I'm like, I'm sure everybody hates me. I'm sure no one wants to talk to me. I'm sure they're thinking, who's this Arab sitting in this classroom? Why is he even here? And so I sat down, put my arms like this, looked very upset, and I'm like, I'm here to learn a language. I'm not here to talk to anyone. And that didn't last long, because honestly, one of the most maybe meaningful moments in my life happened when my teacher, an Israeli Jew, I was the only Palestinian, by the way, in the classroom. My teacher, an Israeli Jew, walked to me and welcomed me in Arabic. And I was completely confused, because to my memory, that was the first time somebody from the other side treated me like a human being and not like the other. I'm used to soldiers telling me whether I can pass to my school or not. I'm used to settlers who we did not have a good relationship with them. I'm not used to the human being on the other side. And you know, I have to say, some soldiers were nice, but when somebody carrying a gun and telling you whether you can pass or not, that's not a place of dialogue. That's not a place where you see someone's humanity, because you're seeing the gun. And in that classroom, it was different. This teacher just welcomed me in Arabic, and I was like, this is confusing. And slowly, as we started learning the language, I was learning more than just a language. I was learning a culture. I was learning about the persons who we're talking about, the stories of the people there, and they were learning about me. And my teacher was just unbelievable, because she understood that her role was not a teacher to teach a language, but a person to teach communications. that to teach us to tell our stories and to be able to listen to other stories. And as that kept going on, I started making friendships with people in this classroom. That was my first friendship with anybody who's Jewish Israeli. And, we didn't speak enough Hebrew to talk about any meaningful political stuff. So we'll talk about music, we'll talk about coffee, we'll talk about these things. And we'll argue. It's the Middle East. We had to argue about something. So we'll argue about coffee. They would like instant coffee, Nescafe, which I think is a horrible coffee. And I'll bring with me Arabic coffee. And I'm like, this is what you really need to drink. And so we had those kind of funny arguments. But eventually we built a strong enough relationship that when we got to the point where our Hebrew was good enough to speak about political things, it wasn't that divisive. We saw the humanity in each other.
How long did it take for you to get to that level?
About 2-3 months,
Oh wow, that's fast.
Hebrew isn't the hardest language, which is great, especially if you're an Arabic speaker. It's very similar because it's the same it's the same root of languages. Aramaic, Arabic, and Hebrew, they the same thing, and so it was really easy for me to learn Hebrew. So yeah, it didn't take much, but when we started having those conversations, it wasn't as divisive. But also, I have to say there was some violence starting to happen at that time, and I could see something change in me because suddenly, if something happened in West Jerusalem, if there was a suicide bombing, if there was attacks, my first thought became, are my friends safe? Are they okay? And that didn't used to be my thought because I didn't know anybody on the other side. So I didn't care. And then the same thing happened when the Israeli army would raid my neighborhood. My new Israeli Jewish friends would call to make sure I'm okay, because before they didn't have any friends in the Palestinian side in Jerusalem. My teacher didn't have necessarily friends in the Palestinian neighborhood, and they started, these new friends I had, they started hearing and understanding that, oh, there are things happening on that other side. We didn't know these things were happening. We now care about what's happening with you. We have a friend there. We don't want him to be hurt. And that, I think, really changes things. When you don't know who's on the other side, you don't care. When you start knowing people's stories, it changes your perception.
Yeah, I agree. Can you continue your story as you went into a career as well?
So from there, I understood that I understood when I was a kid, I felt that I had no choice. And that wasn't true. That I felt I had to respond with anger, with hatred, with revenge. And that wasn't true. I did have a choice. And I realized that for those 8 years, I was angry and seeking revenge. I was being the slave to the person who killed my brother. Because I wasn't making my own choice. I was making their choice. I was living the life they decided for me. And breaking away from that was such a redeeming thing. And it sounds ridiculous maybe to say. It's like, oh, I decided I don't want a revenge. I want to seek a different path. But it made a huge difference in my life, feeling free for the same time. Because anger and hatred and bitterness just makes you feel so empty from within. And being able to let go of that is just such a powerful thing. I also realized how little we knew about each other, and I started learning about Israeli history, culture, narrative, because I knew mine, but I didn't know theirs, and it's vice versa. I think most Israeli Jews don't know the Palestinian narrative and history and culture. And then I joined an organization called Bereaved Families Forum, which is an organization of people who lost family members in the conflict, just like myself, but on both sides. Within a couple of years, I ended up becoming in the leadership of the organization. And a couple of years after, I ended up leading the organization. And what we did was, really, that's when I understood the power of narrative, is bringing Israelis and Palestinians to hear the stories of loss of the other. We started going to high schools, for example, having an Israeli and a Palestinian who lost family members in the conflict together go speak in front of Israeli kids and Palestinian kids, tell them our stories. In almost of these cases, or most of these cases, these students have never met somebody from the other side. So when I spoke to an Israeli group, I would ask, how many of you here had a conversation with a Palestinian before? And the answer usually used to be 0, maybe 1. And the same in Palestinian schools. How many of you have met an Israeli who's not a soldier before? And the answer often was 0. So this experience was very powerful because we were bringing down those walls that divide us and make us unable to hear and understand each other. I started doing a radio show in Arabic and Hebrew, where we would tell these stories in both languages, and I did it with an Israeli colleague. Started working on democracy projects in Palestinian side and how to raise young leadership on the Palestinian side. And my family started getting involved more and more in what I'm doing. When in the beginning, they were very opposed to what I was doing, mainly out of fear. My dad has lost few of his cousins in this conflict. So for him to see me work with Israelis was very hard in the beginning. My mother was terrified. She thought I'm going to get myself killed. That was her biggest worry. And slowly, that started changing. I remember my dad coming to the first meeting I invited him to, and it took years for him to do that. And he sat down, and it was an Israeli-Palestinian big, large gathering, all people who lost family members in the conflict. And as soon as the talks ended, he was the first person to raise his hand and say, I have a question. And I was terrified because I knew if my dad's going to ask questions, probably going to be a horrible question, like parents often do. They embarrass you with these kind of appearances, and you regret even ever inviting them to those things. But he raised his hand, and he did say a horrible question. He said, thank you for all this talk about peace. I would like to know this Holocaust thing. And the moment I heard him say this Holocaust thing, I'm like, this is going bad, because no one starts a sentence with, so this Holocaust thing, and is going to say something constructive ever. And it's like, did it really happen? And honestly, at that moment, I'm like, I wish Earth opens up and swallows me. I don't want to be here. And I already introduced him as my father to everyone, so it's very embarrassing. But it was a very important question because most Palestinians in that room probably thought the same thing.
So yeah, that's what I wanted to ask. Was that a do you really believe that not believe. Is it in the education within Palestine? Is it properly educated about the Holocaust?
No.
So it was a genuine question then.
It is a genuine question. And I think partially, and this is common in conflict zones, when you are in conflict in a fight with somebody, you don't want to teach something that makes you empathize or sympathize with what you perceive as the enemy. So in our education, we never learned a word about the Holocaust because that would provide sympathy. And so we never learned anything, I would argue, about the Jewish or the Israeli narrative. And in that moment, my dad asked a question that everybody knew it was on people's mind, but we kind of were having this, I would argue, shallow, superficial peace-building meeting because we were not dealing with the hard questions. And in that moment, my dad pushed us to say, come on, let's move on. And even though I was embarrassed and I'm like, oh, you shouldn't have asked that in public, it was important. And the person who answered him, somebody who became one of my dearest friends, a Jewish guy, Israeli guy, his father was in Auschwitz. And he stood up and said, I don't expect you to believe or know about something you never learned about. This is absurd. We can't really have that kind of expectation. Everybody needs to believe in it because you just should. Said, I want to take you with my father, the guy who was in Auschwitz, and go to the Holocaust Museum and the memorial and walk you through and have my dad tell you his story. not just go and learn about the history, but learn about really what he went through.
That museum is in Jerusalem, right?
That, yes, it's called Yad Vashem.
Yeah, I think I was there as well.
It's a must, I think, visit for anyone who visits Jerusalem. My dad went, but it wasn't only my dad. 70 others of the Palestinians who were in that meeting decided to go. And that was the biggest delegation of Palestinians who ever went to visit as a group the Yad Vashem at that point. Not just any Palestinians, it's all Palestinians who have grievances with Israel. Everyone had lost a family member in that conflict. The guy who offered them the tour, his daughter was killed by a Palestinian suicide bomber, by the way. So it was this powerful convergence that I've never seen, I think, before. But what's more powerful about that is after the visit, and it wasn't easy, and there were tons of questions, and it took a couple of days dealing with the questions and the conversations and trying to understand what happened. I think it was monumental for the organization, that visit. The Israelis in the organization said, well, now that you've come and learned about our narrative, our history, or part of our narrative, our history, we want to do the same with yours. Not to compare, not to equate, but to understand. And so we started this project then to learn about each other's narrative. And to Israelis would go through Palestinian history, visit Palestinian families, hear about what happened to Palestinians in 1948, the displacement of Palestinians there, 1967. And then we would hear the same thing from the Israelis, what they were going through at the same time. And that was such a powerful experience for us. Just to move forward, I ended up eventually working on other projects that's not related to Israel and Palestine. I ended up working in George Mason University in the States, working on a project related to Afghanistan, where I've done work for a few years, going there, creating a network of leaders to stop young people from joining Taliban. Then I worked in Iran, then I worked in Syria, and then in Colombia on conflict resolution negotiations program, mainly on creating a leadership, working on mobilizing a leadership that is pushing toward nonviolent solutions to conflicts. And this experience of starting to do work all over the world, and now I've worked probably in about 60 countries, has given me so much understanding and perspective that I didn't have when I was working only in Jerusalem. It gets you out of your own kind of world and you see things a bit more clear, I think. You are a little bit less maybe emotional as you understand what's going on everywhere in the world. And you have a lot more ideas of what you can do. And that's when I met my Jewish friend, Scott. He was working at George Mason at the time. And the two of us, you know, he's Jewish and Palestinian, went to Afghanistan together, which takes a lot of trust for a Jewish guy to travel to Afghanistan with a Palestinian. But through that trip, I think we built a real close relationship. We were in situations where colleagues of ours, people who we worked with, were killed. So we were in situations where we didn't know usually if you're going to make it to the next day or not. And as we were doing all this work, we kept thinking, you know, we're connecting people everywhere around the world in conflict zones. What would happen if we take this model of conflict resolution and integrate it in a business model? And we felt not much of that happening. If you're interested in peace, you have to get out of your whatever work you're doing and come to a special meeting that brings people for peace. And that felt wrong because that means we will never reach everyone in the world. We will never make this a part of our life, a culture that we all relate to. And so that's how we ended up starting our own business, MEJDI Tours, which is a social enterprise that focused on bringing this idea of conflict resolution into travel business. And it's not I'm very hesitant because often people call it, oh, so you do alternative tours. And I say, no, we're not doing alternative tours. We're doing normal tours, but we are bringing values into these tours that focus on connecting people and learning and understanding and making relationships that often are missing from these tours. Often you might have a one experience where you might, I don't know, have a cooking class and that's it. That's considered like we've done our part. And we think it's a lot deeper than that. And so we decided to go into what we called multiple narrative and dual narrative travel. We invented this idea of connecting people through understanding that no country has a one story. No place is 100% homogenous, whether it's a conflict zone or not a conflict zone. And so in Jerusalem, we decided to have two tour guides, one Israeli and one Palestinian, co-leading trips together. And when I remember when I did that, I was talking to a few business consultants, friends, and they're like, this is the dumbest idea you could come up with. And their argument is, who would want to pay a little more to hear about these two narratives? People going to be afraid that's going to be always a fight. People going to think, oh, this is going to be depressing. And it's anything but a fight or depressing. That didn't really happen, still doesn't happen. The guides actually get along with each other even when they disagree. And that's partially because we have background in conflict resolution, so we knew how to build this team. They would, instead of talking only about politics, they talk about culture, about history, about poetry, about music, which 99% of tours don't give you the multiple perspective. If you have a Jewish guide, you'll get the Israeli culture and history and music. If you get a Palestinian guide, you'll get the Palestinian side. And as much as knowledgeable they might be about the other side, it's still different. And yeah, and then from there, we started growing to other areas, from Northern Ireland to Colombia to all these places, and trying to bring those kind of stories that people often don't hear.
How, just for context, how big is the business now? Do you have investors in it? Like, what's the structure of a business like that?
So the business started 10 years ago, but 10 years ago when we started, it was kind of a side hustle. We still continue to work in our day jobs because we didn't know how long it takes for it to take off. And in 2004, 2005, respectively, the two of us quit our university jobs and decided to focus on the business. And since then, it started growing faster. Before the pandemic, we were I don't know, maybe about 15 people in the company.
Wait, 2004 or 2014?
Oh, 2014. I'm sorry. Yes, thank you. Yeah, in 2014, 15, we started. We both quit our jobs and decided to focus fully on this endeavor. And yeah, before the pandemic, we were at I think 15 people, if my counting is right. My business partner is more the person who really runs the business, and I focus mostly on new destinations, content, these kind of development. So I don't deal as much with how do you run everyday operations. I try to focus on
Product
how do you build
development.
how do we build this business. And it's amazing. If you even last week, I know there was the last few weeks in Israel and Palestine, there was all the things going on in Gaza and in Jerusalem. And I love what we built because I'm watching our tour guides, I'm watching our staff who are mixed. And it's just amazing to see the difference between shallow and real relationships, because I've seen relationships being completely destroyed in this time where people lost trust in each other. And then I look at the people I work with who spend days and weeks and really work in an equal setting, and those relationships didn't get destroyed. People were able to talk about tough things, disagreed sometimes, but there was a stronger bond than, okay, now I'm not gonna talk to you again. That's it, which happened a lot in the last few weeks, unfortunately. So that's what else you wanted to know about the company, the settings?
No, I wanted to know about that team and conflict resolution model that you discussed because um, what is that model that you use that gets your employees who technically, if you follow the media, should be hating each other, but yet they talk about? And I think maybe what I'm more interested in, because it's more relevant to the context of everybody who listens, maybe, um, what do you do specifically in that conflict resolution model that makes them want to have a discussion, disagree, and yet still like each other instead of just say, that's it?
Um, so the conflict resolution model we use is one, equality, which is something often missing in those situations. Look, there's a power structure in Israel. Israelis are more powerful, more strong, economically speaking. That's the case. When Scott and I started our business, it was surprising to people because there are very few joint businesses between Jews and Palestinians. It's almost non-existent. And unfortunately, there are obviously few I can mention, but it's so small in considering the reality that we live right next to each other, that there are Palestinians who are Israeli citizens. It doesn't happen much. And when we started our business, we said we're going to focus on equality as one thing that doesn't usually happen. So our staff or our tour guides, for example, are equally paid. That's not always the case. Often Israelis paid more. In reality, often the Israeli is a boss and the Palestinian works for them. And I know this because when I'm often with some of my tour guides, out for a drink and they meet some of their friends. And I remember one day I was with a friend named Yuval. He's a tour guide and a journalist, and we meet some of his friends, and he introduces me and he says, "This is Aziz. He's my boss." And the faces they had, it was very funny in the sense that, like, his name is Aziz and he's your boss, but how? And I'm standing there and they were like, that doesn't happen. And so that's one thing that's really important, is creating that equal footings, that saying there is no power structure that we are borrowing from outside and bringing into our company. We will create a company that's focused on equity and equality between everyone. We're not going to pay you based on your nationality and ethnicity and religion and so on. But also we make sure there are regular discussions, meetings between our staff, our tour guides. We create a community instead of just a workforce, and that's really, really important. People like each other, and through these meetings and working together, and when you're guiding together, you are sometimes a week or 10 days spending every day and every night with the other person. And so it builds a really strong relationship. So strong that when that guy Yuval, who I told you about, when he got married, he married an Israeli Jewish woman. They invited one of the tour guides, Palestinian tour guides he worked with a lot, to be the officiator of the wedding, the rabbi. A Palestinian wore a yarmulke and stood there under the chuppah, the tent you create for Jewish weddings, and was the officiator of the wedding. So this is another just example of how strong these relationships get. We make it clear that our goal isn't to agree, but our goal is to respect each other. I think pretty much everyone who works in our company is against violence as a mean to solve conflicts, and so that helps a lot. Everyone goes and visits because we talk about dual narratives. We learn really what the other narrative is. The Israelis in our company understand what Palestinians go through, I would say more than anybody else probably in Israel. And Palestinians in our company understand what Israelis think and what they go through more than any other Palestinian in the country, because they live it, they have these discussions, there's nothing taboo to talk about. And by creating these kind of conversations, it creates real relationships. We even visit each other's homes quite often. Like some of the tour guides I work with, I know their parents. Actually, in the midst of everything was going on in Jerusalem a few weeks ago, it was Ramadan, I was in Jerusalem, and one of my tour guides decided to invite his family to come to do Ramadan, and one of my colleagues, Israeli colleagues in the company, also her family, and they came and did Ramadan with my family. And so they did the breaking of the fast together, and it was like 20 people coming to visit, 20 Israeli Jews coming to my home, eating the breaking of the fast in Ramadan with them, having conversation about politics, about quite a lot of issues that you don't often see. And so these kind of bonds that are created are not easily breakable.
Maybe I want to go a little bit deeper into the bonds then. So I understand when there's no conflict, but as you said a couple of weeks ago, there was some conflict. As a as a founder, you're the owner of this company with your partner. What is like the instinct that goes on? There's a crisis going on. Like, how are you making sure that what are the discussions like, I guess, and how do you make sure that those discussions actually happen? Do you sit them down in a room? Do you force them? Do you ask them certain questions? Uh, could you elaborate, like, when tensions were high a couple of weeks ago, what did you do with your team and how did they get through that?
So, one, we understand there are moments that people need to be alone and to process things on their own. So we don't push people to come to a meeting in the midst of all of this, because there are moments where people are angry, people are afraid, people are having a lot of feelings they still haven't processed. So we don't go and say, hey, you must come to this meeting tomorrow. But we did create meetings and said, if you feel this is important for you, you can come. And actually, the vast majority of people did show up, even though it wasn't like you have to come to this meeting. And we facilitated the discussion. How are you feeling? What's going on? What's you dealing with? And in those moments, the rest listen and not try to argue. And that's, I think, big part of it is you don't just try to go, oh, but you don't understand. Like if my colleague in Tel Aviv is saying, I was in a safe room and I had to hide because of the rockets coming from Gaza, nobody on the Palestinian side would jump in and say, but you don't understand what you're doing to Gaza. Those kind of conversations never even happened, which to me is amazing because you always expect something like this to pop up. And the same thing when people on the Palestinian side, a colleague from the West Bank would talk about what's happening there, or Jerusalem, or talk about Gaza, the Israelis did not jump on and say, but you don't understand, Hamas is this, which is what you often see on TV, is like whatever you say, there's a but. Let me tell you why your pain is meaningless. Let me tell you why your pain is irrelevant. Let me tell you how you are the reason you are suffering. And we don't do that. We instead listen, understand, and try to think together of what can we do to make things better as a company, rather than trying to dwell on, let's see who to blame. And I think most of us, it's always impossible to say all or hard to say all, but most of us are very strong in that mindset of let's think how we can help. Let's think of the conversations we can create. Let's think of who do we need to reach out to, and that's what we focused on. And I think trying to focus on the positive even in those moments and what we can do rather than on just how miserable things are, trying to be also action oriented is very important. And that we've done quite in the past quite a lot in tons of crises when they happen wherever they are. I just can give you example when we work in Lebanon, for example, when the Lebanon explosion happened last summer, our thought was, how can we help? And we started working with our partners and friends there who we often invite to speak and meet with our tourists, and created a group of volunteers who were going to homes and fixing people's homes in this time. And we eventually ended up raising some money and sending it so people can buy supplies to fix those homes. So if you need a new aluminum frame, if you need new glass, if you need cleaning material, if you need whatever they needed, we've raised some money and sent it to them so they're able to do that. So our focus, even as a company, is often on, yes, talk about the conversation, talk about the pain. Let's not try to say, oh, your pain isn't as big as mine. Talk about the problems, talk about the injustices. When we have disagreement about what is happening, talk about why. I saw my guides going back and forth about what's happening in Jerusalem with the displacement of families there, talking about the legal aspect, sending to each other documents. Is this legal, not legal? But that discussion is not done as you want to displace us. It was done in the sense of let's understand what's really happening here. Let's have a serious discussion about it. And I was amazed that they were like doing historical research, sending it to each other. And that doesn't happen. That doesn't happen between Israeli and Palestinian guides literally anywhere in the country. This is the one probably group that was going back and forth and having that discussion. And it's frustrating to me that it's not happening more.
So, in short, if I distill it, you're facilitating a discussion where people listen to each other but aren't allowed to blame each other. And instead of blaming, so instead of that anger that you had when you were a child, you go the opposite way, which is instead of blaming, you go, what is the solution? How can we help? And I guess what you're trying to achieve then, correct me if I'm wrong, is a philosophy of the more good we do, eventually it'll pay off, or how?
Yes, but also it's partially blame never changes reality. You don't create change by just blame. You create change by doing something. And that's our focus. It's what can we as a company do to promote a change in our society. Look, for me, issues of justice are very important. And so when I see, like, I go and protest, when I'm in Jerusalem, I'm protesting the evictions or displacement of these families in East Jerusalem. And I think it's very important we all work on issues of justice, regardless who's the subject of it, a Palestinian, an Israeli, anywhere in the world, a Lebanese, a Colombian, a Venezuelan, wherever that is, we as a company should be working and helping. But in the same time, I think our role is not just to say, well, here's who we should blame, and instead think, what is it that a company like ours can do? And, we are a company, so we can't take political stands and we can't be a non-profit. We have to also remember that. But what is a company like ours can do to make a difference? What is a company like ours can do to facilitate conversation? So, for example, I told you most Israelis and Palestinians really don't know what is happening on the other side. So by having two tour guides, we facilitated many discussions that were open to the public, to Israelis, Palestinians, internationals, to come and hear Palestinian and Israeli talking about what's happening on their sides. And hundreds of people would show up on each one of these in the last few weeks because it was very important, and people felt the media was not giving them an accurate picture of what's going on. So the Israeli will come and talk about, I'm in Tel Aviv, here's what's going on, and I'll talk, for example, or the Palestinian guide will talk about, I'm in Jerusalem, here's what's going on in Jerusalem, here's what I hear from Gaza. And those kind of conversations unfortunately, are not happening. So we were one of the few organizations providing, or maybe one of the only companies providing a space of conversation for Israelis, Palestinians, internationals, that's coming from both Israelis and Palestinians.
In which language do these talks happen? Are everybody speaking Hebrew? Everybody speaking English? Or yeah, how do they understand each other?
We've done a few in multiple languages. So no, people don't speak, unfortunately, each other's language necessarily. So there's a mix of these meetings in different languages. We do a lot in English because a lot of Palestinians and a lot of Israelis do speak English, but many don't speak each other's language, Arabic and Hebrew. And still, we've done some of those as well.
Do you have a translator on site then?
We don't have a translator. We haven't. So probably one of our biggest weakness is figuring out how do we do better technology work. And I know when we talked last time I mentioned, this is something we are now exploring a lot more, is how do we take the work we do and if from where it is now, where we bring people, groups to a country and they learn the multiple narratives, to make it much more available for others through technology. And that's our next, I think, level as a company. But yeah, even on translation, we haven't yet figured out those things.
Yeah, I was literally just gonna ask, as in, have you explored digital? I know that you've had talks on National Geographic, TED Talk. Have you ever considered doing a sort of TED Talk, but in your company's format, where you can record it, subtitle it, maybe even translate, dub it, or something like that? I guess put an iPhone to film somebody. Have you ever considered something like that and going digital?
Yeah, that's where we are now. I think as horrible as the pandemic is for a travel company, because literally for now a year and 3 months we're not running actual in-person travel, we realized the importance of digital. So one, we started doing a lot of digital products. Like we started doing a lot of tours online, virtual tours and cooking classes and conversations. Some of those were actual tours where people sign up and pay for it, and some of it was free products that we offer to the community. But now we are going a bit beyond and thinking how we as a company can move on in this technological world. But mainly, I think our thinking, if we become the biggest travel company in the world, we'll reach 50,000 people a year, 40,000 people a year, something like that. It's not big. And our goal in starting this business was to make an impact on the whole world. And digital is one of the ways you can do that. We're still in the planning phases of what exactly we're gonna do. But we are hopeful by next year we will have some product that will be embodying the concept of MEJDI Tours and this connecting people through travel, through digital mean that everybody can have access to it.
Do you have a head of marketing? Because it sounds like you don't really have a head of marketing.
You are so good. We didn't have a head of marketing until this week. We just we just hired a marketing person, and the reason, I think for many years I kind of handled marketing natural. I don't know what do you call it, just spontaneous, I guess, marketing.
Word of mouth, usually, yeah.
Word of mouth marketing, going to events, speaking on some radios, writing, coming from a bit. I've done a lot of journalism, which I didn't talk about earlier. So that has given me a little bit of ability to market what we do. But now I'm realizing I can't really be the person doing that. And so passed it on just this week to someone new who actually lives in Europe, in Madrid.
If you want, I can offer. We do a lot of European and international campaigns in my main company. If you want, I can offer like to help consult a bit, help out for free, of course. My team is also available. We can give you some ideas or something like that. Because like
You might regret that offer.
I always offer. Nobody like has made me regret it yet. But the reason I was thinking that is just like, I mean, technically, our businesses, if you look at just startup funding events, is in some way quite similar industries. It's events that went international. Obviously, nowhere close to what you're doing, conflict resolution and stuff like that. But I would say from the business model, we can share quite a lot because we've gone international, we've gone across continents as well. Um, so yeah, happy to brief. I don't know what the experience is of your head of marketing, but yeah.
I appreciate that. And especially one of our challenges, and I think you asked about that earlier and I didn't answer it. One of our challenges is being a smaller company we started it with zero seed money. So we had to do everything and learn everything ourselves. So my business partner and I, coming from conflict resolution background, had to really understand business as much as possible. And as good as we still have a lot to learn. But because we didn't have, we weren't really a startup in the sense of funding wise, at least we did everything ourselves. We never borrowed until last year. We never borrowed any money, never had any investor, still don't. And part of the reason we didn't is the fear over, well, two reasons: the fear over our content, our fear of investors who would want us to prioritize profit over quality, and many investors would. And travel isn't the most, it is a profitable business, but it's not the most. It doesn't give you as much return and as a like high tech, for example, or businesses like that. So we had a lot of fear of how do you deal with that, how do you go around it. And so we've chosen to go on the conservative side and grow slowly and keep control over the quality of the business. Because if you lose that aspect of connection and over commercialize it, like, we understand you need the commercial aspect, and the company has been profitable through the whole time. But we didn't want to go too hardcore. We are a B Corp as well.
Yeah, I know B Corp.
I'm sure what you, yeah. And so for us, the mission is quite important. And that's where I think where we were slow. But as we're getting older, we also want this message to be spread further. And you realize, well, I don't have 100 years to get this message going. And so we starting to think more and more, like you mentioned earlier, about digital, about marketing, and how do you push this concept more. And I see we succeeded more in Israel because we started there in Israel and Palestine, where other companies have now adopted our methodology. And to me, that is, on one hand, you're like, oh, we have competition. But on the other hand, that's fantastic, because it means we're reaching out more and more people. Even companies who don't really believe in our concept are starting to use our terminology of dual narrative and multiple narrative. That word, dual narrative travel, didn't exist at all 10 years ago. And today, if you want to book a tour with a company in Israel and Palestine, many companies might offer you that concept, even if it's not exactly the way we're doing it or so on. But we succeeded into changing the whole conversation around travel in Israel and Palestine. Our goal now is taking it and changing that conversation in the other 30 countries we're working on, and making this more available to people, even if they're traveling from home, even if they're not leaving their home, making that concept available. And it's tricky because I've looked at travel apps, for example, and things like that, and majority of travel apps have failed.
Yeah, we've had a couple of going through our events as well. I don't think an app is your future, though. Maybe I'm wrong, of course, but from the concepts I've seen scale through our events, from the campaigns I've been a part of and within my main company, I feel like what you guys are going into is more of an influencer type thing, but I guess what you also have the advantage and disadvantage of, from what it sounds like, is you were a first mover, but you were not as digitally adept as your competitors. So you're like a Tesla, but you're not innovating as fast as Tesla, from what I understand from your story, but you're still a first mover. I'm getting really businessy. Like, you're a very mission-driven company, but you have the first mover advantage. So I think there's just in general a huge demand for this if people want peace. And not just in, I would say, the most complicated area in the world. So if you can kind of figure it out there, you might be able to figure it out everywhere. So I know, just from what I was thinking as you were saying this, maybe some listeners will say it in the comments, but I'm just thinking if you have a YouTube channel that, or like Facebook now has been promoting crazily that they're not going to take any creators funds and partner revenue until 2023. But if you have just like a channel of those type of things, very shareable content. I know that Nas Daily, he's a Palestinian as well. It's going crazy on Facebook for years now. I feel like that's kind of more the future because people need to hear your story. I'm fascinated. I literally only read a text, and I'm getting more and more interested in your story and everything. And luckily, we still have some time to cover it. But I feel like maybe the future for you is more towards influencer and content creator than it is to create like a app or something.
That's really helpful. I haven't, honestly, that wasn't where I was going. So this is definitely helpful.
I mean, in general, I'm thinking a video of you, those two guides, the Jewish one and the Palestinian one, going through Jerusalem and going through the Palestinian side and just giving a tour with no political narrative would be on its own quite. I would click on it. I kind of want. I have no idea as a European what is actually happening except for what you see on CNN and all those things. I have no idea how people live, uh, and every time you see something, there is always some type of propaganda happening. You know that they're just pushing some type of narrative, both sides, and everybody, like you said, has their own perspective, but just literally an objective point of view, how people like, what is it looking like? What do people do every day? Like just basic things that the media doesn't share. I think that alone is clickable on YouTube and shareable on Facebook as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I, yeah, I agree. And it's maybe a little crazy that for 10 years we haven't really done that. Not only in Israel and Palestine. I mean, I can imagine that Northern Ireland with a nationalist and a unionist, or
Yeah, like Vice News or Fox or something. Like Vice News does it like amazingly. They have these amazing little documentaries, like 5 to 10 minutes. But even there, it's like it kind of feels they're trying to be objective. But even there, it's like I feel like they're pushing some narrative sometimes. But they have like a great way of editing it, super pretty. Um, like they try to get both perspectives, and those things go like millions of views. I had a question actually, going back to the beginning of your story, which is a really technical question. And then I want to go back to, again, a little bit of the psychology of your conflict resolution. So the first question I had was, you kept mentioning, we go to each other's houses, 70 Palestinians would go to the museum. I'm a European and I only see the news. I believe honestly that entrepreneurship is almost stronger than politics, and that's partially why I wanted you on the podcast. You're trying to make a change, whereas politics is almost stuck. And you have the choice to choose a certain narrative, whereas with politics, again, you got voted for a certain narrative. It's really hard to change later. So my question is just a really technical question. How does that work from a security point of view? You guys going to each other's houses? Like, is that possible? Is it easier because you have a business so you can get certain permits? Can 70 Palestinians just go to any city or like a museum? Like, how does that work?
no, it's a lot more complicated than it sounds between Israelis and Palestinians, and that's why people don't know each other, because they can't. So the only way you can get those Palestinians from the West Bank to go to a museum in Jerusalem, or in Tel Aviv, or in Haifa, is to get permits from the military. And that's a whole process and a nightmare in itself, because you have to get the applications ready, you send it, and you often don't get the okay or not okay until the night before or the morning of, which means you plan everything hoping that you will get the permit. Sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. And when you do, it's not always everyone. The same, Israelis are not allowed by Israeli law to go to Palestinian cities in the West Bank. You need to get permits for that, and it's not easy to get those permits. There are a couple of areas that are legally okay for people to meet at. It's and kind of crazy, but because of settlements who are in the West Bank, Israeli settlements in the West Bank, that creates small areas, not within the settlements, but kind of the ways around, where Palestinians from the West Bank are allowed to be there, but Israelis are also allowed to be there. And so we do some of the meetings in those kind of places. Our tour guides usually have the Palestinians from the West Bank have permits. Some of our tour guides are from Jerusalem, so they don't need a permit if they're from East Jerusalem. So yeah, it's a lot of work trying to get everything done in a security and legality and all of that, where it works for everyone, and it adds a hurdle for us, but we somehow have been able to often overcome that. I'll give you an example of how a hurdle it is. We have this guide from the West Bank who's one of our best tour guides, and he has a permit. He can work within Israel from the West Bank, come in, but he can't pass it through all checkpoints as you travel from one area to another. And one of the days on the tours, sometimes we go from Jerusalem all the way to Galilee, going through Jericho, and you drive by the Jordan Valley. There's a checkpoint in that Jordan Valley. He's not allowed to pass it through. So on that day, he normally would join the trip in the morning, go to Jericho, go to the Jordan River, meet some people there, and then we would have to get a cab that will drive him from there through another route that he is allowed to take. And then he will meet the people across of the checkpoint on the other side, or in the hotel when they reach their hotel in Galilee. So that's an expense we willing to take. That's an example, I think, where you have to make a decision of what's more valuable to you. You can hire a Palestinian guide from Jerusalem instead, and then never hire this guy from Bethlehem. But for us, that would be a loss, because he is an amazing tour guide. And yes, it ends up costing us a few $100s more out of pocket to make him the tour guide. Totally worth it. And that's where equality becomes. You can't take him out just because the reality on the ground makes it more complex to use him as a tour guide. So yeah, it is complicated, but we always find a way to go around it.
Another question I had is, again, less related to the business, more to the psychology. I do have some business questions later, because it's very fascinating to have a business like that in such a conflict area. But related to the conflicts and the psychology, you also mentioned in the beginning, especially when that man offered to do the tour because he was in Auschwitz and stuff like that. What do you notice that both sides learn that makes them more open to actually seeking for peace? What is it on the Jewish side or Israeli side, and what is it on the Palestinian side? Like, what are the stories that make them start actually becoming potential friends, or just listen to each other in an empathic way?
So one thing similar between every side, whether it's even Israeli Palestinians or Catholic and Protestants in Ireland, or in Egypt, Christian and Muslim, or any of the tours we run anywhere, there's one common denominator that I found really important. Oh, we also do Democrat, Republican in the United States, which, by the way, is harder than Israeli Palestinian. You told me Israel, if you can do Israel Palestine, everything is easier, except Republican Democrat. People here can be very hardcore about their political identity in the U.S. But one common denominator that I found really amazing, if you start right away talking about positions, ideology, differences, arguments, and that, you get nowhere. People harden, they become crystallized in their positions, and they attack you right away. So what we promote is, instead of doing that, always start with personal stories. Always start with something relating to you. And I think it works in general, not just in our business. If you tell an experience that you've gone through, it's harder for people to brush it away. Some might, but most people won't say, "Oh yeah, that's false," which is what they would do when you say, "Well, this happened, numbers here, statistics." They go, "Well, I'm not sure about your numbers. I'm not, well, but you didn't think about this." But when you tell your story, that changes how people listen. We have more capacity to sympathize with a personal story and use the personal story as an educational moment of maybe the larger context at the end. So that's what I found working everywhere we go, which is opposite of what we are taught in tourism. You often, if you're a tour guide, taught don't bring yourself in. You as a tour guide, you tell facts about whatever, wherever you're going. Here's the site. Here's what happened 2,000 years ago. Here's what happened 100 years ago. Let's move on. And we tell our guides, don't do that. Yes, you're eventually going to, but always start with how do you relate to the site yourself? How do you relate to the story yourself? And when you do that, people are way more willing to listen and change. I remember on a tour I was leading, and day one of the tour, this guy comes to me, and I was in shock he's on our tour, because he comes to me and he says, "I think the only solution for this Israel-Palestine is for the Arabs to move to Jordan." Like, you want to displace 6 million people from their homes? That's your solution? Is kick out all the Arabs? This is a Jewish state. No Arabs should live here. That's a solution. That was his opinion on day one of the tour. And day 5 of the tour, he heard, so we bring speakers who tell their stories, and he heard many Israelis, many Palestinians. We had the 2 tour guides model. And on day 5 of a 10-day tour, he comes to me and he says, "I revised my opinion. I think the only solution is for you to live together and be able to create a shared government together." And regardless of which solution you think is the right solution for the conflict, to me, that was a progress, because he went from, "I want to displace millions of people," to, and I asked him, what changed your mind? And it wasn't because somebody made a good political analysis. It's like, well, I love the people I met. I don't want to see anyone lose their home. And that's what changes people more than anything else. Stories are the most powerful thing. If you want to talk about actual things that people have found moving for them, I think for most Israelis, it was hearing a day-to-day struggle, not like, "Oh, well, Israel did this and Israel did that 10 years ago, 50 years ago, whatever." That doesn't usually really surprise them or move them. I think when you go through a day-to-day and you say, like that tour guide I mentioned to you, that story of that tour guide going, not being able to go through the checkpoint, that I think more shocking to Israelis than many other things of like, "Oh, I can't go to buy this because there's a checkpoint on my way. I can't get to the doctor because there's a checkpoint on my way." Things like that are touches, again, your story. I went through this and here's what stopped me. The daily suffering. That would be the hardest thing for Palestinians, for Israelis, or one of the surprising things that Israelis learn. For Palestinians, I think the Holocaust definitely one. Many don't know about it, but I think many Palestinians don't think of Israelis suffering from the current reality, the occupation. They see the suffering that we go through, but they don't see. They don't really ever hear an Israeli talk about their pain, about their suffering, because they see Israeli as powerful, strong. They have weapons, they have army, they have all of that. And when somebody talks about their fear, it seems to me always shocking to a Palestinian. So when one of our guides will talk about how, when they hear the siren when there are rockets, they running in the middle of the night to a safe room and to a shelter, and how they terrified from it. It's shocking to most Palestinians to hear that. In their mind, Israel is so powerful, there is no fear. And when they hear that personal story of fear, they're like, "Oh, that's an area we relate to each other. I thought I'm the only one who have fear." And to realize that fear is real on both sides is surprising to many Palestinians.
How do you get someone to collaborate though? Because what you're describing right now is more of a, okay, we understand each other, and of course I asked that, but how do you get that to, well, I guess it opens the door to potential collaboration towards peace, but let's say a Palestinian now discovers somebody has fear. I feel like if I would discover my enemy had fear, my reaction would be less like, oh, okay, like they also have fear. It'd be more like, well, at least they also have fear type of thing. Not that I condone that reaction, of course, but like, how do you get that reaction to, hey, we need to actually work towards peace?
You are absolutely right, and not necessarily everyone who realizes that would go for peace right away. But I think what it does, it humanizes Israelis to Palestinians, because when you see an Israeli as the image of just the soldier and the gun and the occupier, you don't think there's a way to work with somebody like that. And when you hear a story of, I'm also afraid, I'm also like you, I also want to have safety just like you want to have safety, that drives you much more to say, oh, there is a common dominator between us. There is something we can talk about, and there is something maybe we can collaborate on. So that's one. I think, I'll add one more. To most Palestinians, they don't know that Israelis can sympathize with them. And when they meet an Israeli who says, yeah, I feel for you, I understand what you're going through, that's always shocking to Palestinians. And I know it was shocking for me when it first happened. So that also helps bring people together and say, oh, you understand what I'm going through. I never expected to hear that from someone from the other side. So those are the things that eventually you have a common feeling that will make you humanize whoever on the other side, and then that makes you more willing to say, so what do we do so you don't have to live in fear, I don't have to live in fear. Where instead, I think what I often say, instead of seeing this us and them, Israeli versus Palestinians, there's always an us of them and them. But the us and them, in my opinion, should be us, those of us who believe in working together, working for peace, working for justice, working for a shared society, and them, those who have not joined us yet. And if you imagine the world in that way, there is no enemy in some ways. Those who are on the other side hopefully will eventually be on this side. And this side isn't run by nationality, religion, ethnicity. It's run by commitment to justice and peace, regardless, for everyone. And that's a common dominator.
Yeah, I love that. I love that philosophy as well because it puts your perspective towards let's have peace, and the people that don't, we just have to convince them towards peace. Um, I wanted to go deeper. I think we depleted those stories, although I can imagine there are way more still. But I wanted to go deeper into another topic that I find a lot, especially because we did, uh, you know, we try to support as many minorities as we can, from females in tech to just we had like a 13-year-old kid on our stage and stuff like that. So just diversity, not just in the usual term of diversity, but also, age and gender, everything else. So I would say what you're going through could be probably, well, that's the question. Have you experienced racism in the endeavor of your business? How did you deal with it? Obviously, you have two sides. You have a Jewish partner, you're Palestinian. Can you deal with the initial dealings of racism and how you went through it? And I would say the more pivotal ones that people can learn from.
Well, I'll start with saying some people won't work with us because I'm a Palestinian, or won't work with us because my partner is Jewish. And that makes us lose good amount of business, probably. The moment people know, oh, you are a partner with a Jew, I'm not going to travel with you. Or, oh, to him, you are a partner with a Palestinian, how can we trust that? We're not going to travel with you. And so that's one area that we definitely suffer. And we understand that, but then I think I'm not sure if these people are ready yet to travel with us. I hope there's a way to convince them. I remember one trip I was setting up where the person who was wanting to do this trip decided, no, we're not going to travel with you to Israel. We'll travel with an Israeli company, but maybe we'll hire you to do the Palestinian side. And I said, yeah, that's fine. We can do the Palestinian side. And I suggested that they do homestays. And they agreed. But then when I sent them the price, they said, oh, it's expensive. And I said, yeah, because I will pay the homestays exactly like I'm paying a hotel. I'm not gonna, I know I can get them cheaper because people are desperate, but I will not take advantage of them. And by the way, by saying paying them like a hotel, we're talking about $50 a night per person. We're not talking about like thousands of dollars and like, oh, you're taking advantage of them. And they decided not to travel with us because they said, oh, we can get it for $30 from another company. That's fine. You can, and it'll be the same families. It's just I'm not willing to be a participating in this race to the bottom. How cheap can I sell my things, and how much can I take it from my vendors? And it's not always necessarily racism, although I think sometimes it is, because that same person was running a trip in Israel paying thousands of dollars, had no problem with that. But racism kind of can go into economics. Where you're willing to spend how much is part of it. And for us, this race to the cheapest is a problematic. And I see it a lot, honestly, in travel, even with companies that would claim social responsibility to the client. When it comes to the actual vendor, how cheap can I get it regardless?
But is that racism? It sounds more like capitalism, because I'm assuming the other company that can get it is a Palestinian who's probably haggling the price down even more.
You are right. It is classism, capitalism, but sometimes it is motivated by racism in the sense of, if I'm willing to pay higher price for people who look like me, but lower price for people who look lower for the same job, then I think racism is part of it. And that's what I felt with that group. It's not always the case. With bigger companies, I think it is absolutely capitalism. And I get it, except when people claim to be socially responsible and responsible business on their websites. But then when you actually see the reality of how do you treat your end customer or end vendor, you'll find, how can I get the cheapest product possible? And that's very frustrating to me, because I know the people who are traveling care, and that's why they're traveling with these companies. But it's very hard for a traveler to know what's the end, how are people being compensated. And so I often tell my travelers, don't ever be shy of asking, have you paid your vendors, and how much even have you paid? I don't want to normally detail every payment I do, but I do want people to ask, are you paying fairly or not? And I'll give an example. Oh, this person we met got paid this much money. In Jordan, for example, we go and meet with Syrian refugees, go to their homes, and I do it on purpose because I know those families well. These are younger people who are in college, they can't pay their college. So one way we support them, say, we're gonna bring some tourists, you're gonna have some tea with them, and I want you to tell them about your life, about being a refugee, what it's like, how did you end up going to college, those kind of stories. And it's, to me, amazing because eventually those meetings pays for this person college through the year. And you can pay, I can get that person for literally a fraction of the price I'm paying, but I'm not gonna do that because at the end, the additional cost per customer is so minimal that it's, to me, it drives me crazy that we can negotiate over a $50 payment to a person instead of paying 100, being 150 or 200. When you divide that by the 15 travelers, you're talking about a $5 extra per person. And yet you are often pushed to be, oh no, can you lower the price $5, $10, $20? Like that is so not fair, especially when you are at somebody's home drinking their tea and you're not feeling comfortable when we go out to a restaurant and you pay $15 or $10 for the same thing. and you don't even get the home, you don't get the person telling you the story. It's not always just capitalism. It is prejudice. It is feeling I can get a deal. And I think that feeling of I must get a deal is not always a good feeling. It's not always a good thing. Yes, you don't want to, and I have to kind of counter here, say you don't want to overpay as well, because that creates also an economic problem. But you have to be careful in that. Um, Sorry, I went off the
No,
racism
no,
thing because
I want to ask more examples of racism because I like that. However, with this example, I want to go a little bit deeper because I've also traveled quite a lot. Sometimes I feel like when people go into these homestays and everything, especially in these conflict areas, again, what I've heard, I don't know, so I want to ask you because you're actually a CEO of a company like that. So I feel like people are over exaggerating what is happening and demonizing the other side so they can get a bigger tip. So my question is, like, are you choosing families knowing that they only speak the truth? Like, how do you know when they're saying the truth or when they're like wanting more money type of thing? Like, could you elaborate on that?
yes, absolutely. And I think we're not working on the tip. I don't think really our families get much tip. We try to pay fair so they don't have to depend on tip, and try to tell a story that would make people want to pay them more. And by communicating to our travelers, look, yes, you're paying a little extra, but then you don't have to feel that guilt of like, oh, should I tip or not? So that solves part of the problem. We do know the families we work with. I don't censor them, even if they're gonna say things I disagree with. I want people to hear whatever those families want to say, but then I try to provide a counter to whatever argument they might have heard. So if I'm taking people to do a homestay in Bethlehem, I want try to mix the families between the Christian and Muslim families, which already will create different stories. And when they meet back together, they share with each other what they heard. And it's fascinating because it'll be not all the same. It's not like this perfect narrative. And that's the whole concept I'm trying to provide, create, is there is no perfect narrative, one story, all these families will tell you. But then we go back to Jerusalem, and we often will go back to a Shabbat dinner with a Jewish rabbi in his home, who will tell a totally different story. And they'll spend like 5-6 hours with this family, hearing, learning about the food and the culture, but also talking about politics, talking about reality, talking and asking questions from what they might have heard from the Palestinian families. So it makes it easier for me to not feel I need to make sure everything said is right and is kosher, because who am I to judge what's right? They talking about their experience, and I don't want to tell people don't share your experience. Now, if I know a family is promoting absolute lies or promoting discord and not really being truthful about anything, it's not just their experience, then I wouldn't work with that family again. And that has happened a couple of times, but it's quite rare, actually. I think partially because we come to them from this concept of, hey, we're not gonna do the race to the bottom. We want you to be honest, be who you are. We'll pay you fair, and just we actually don't want you to ask money from the travelers. This is not for begging. Um, it does work, and sometimes amazing things happen. That's not asking for money. We had a group stay with farmers in Jenin once, and this group came back to the United States and started importing olive oil from these families directly. And I was very happy about it because it wasn't asking for money. They were asking for help connecting them to businesses in the US where they can sell their olive oil to there, which would help these families. And that started a relationship that until 2-3 years ago, when last time I checked on it, it started almost 10 years ago. It was one of our first groups. Until a couple of years ago when I last checked, they were still importing oil from these families and selling it for them in Michigan in the US.
That's nice. I have maybe a more personal question before we get back to the story. I was in Israel and I remember thinking or like asking around like to go to Palestine or something like that. But then there's always like this fear of going to Palestine. So as a tour guide, can you maybe explain like is it safe going there? How do you guarantee safety? Like what's the process look like for that stuff?
It's extremely safe to go there. I think you as a tourist have more rights than any of us living there. You have more freedom of movement than any of us there. And most, I would say, the absolute vast majority, almost everyone, doesn't want to really get tourists involved in our problems because tourists are our, what do you call it, bread and butter, I guess. And so people might be very political, hardcore about whatever issue, but when it comes to tourists, they're not antagonistic, and you'll see it both with Israelis and Palestinians. If you go to the West Bank, places like Bethlehem, they're so used to tourists, so you don't even need to really think too much about it. I can't think of like it is so rare for tourists to be attacked or hurt in the West Bank. It's I can't honestly think of any example of the recent years. Make sure though when you talk to people, the one mistakes often people do, and it does upset Palestinians, is they go to Bethlehem and they learned a few words in Hebrew in Jerusalem or in Tel Aviv, and they go to Bethlehem and try to speak those Hebrew words, and it shows complete ignorance when you do that, and it does upset people. It's like, that's not my language, so why are you talking? And it's not your language, so why are you talking to me in Hebrew? If you're gonna learn something, learn a few words in Arabic when you go there. People do like that. You will find people being very hospitable. Don't go only to the touristy sites like in Bethlehem alone. Go to Ramallah, go to a restaurant, go talk to people. You'll find Palestinians are extremely hospitable. You'll meet people on the bus if you're taking transportation, public transportation, who'll probably invite you to have lunch or dinner in their home, and it's quite safe to do that. Obviously, if a young woman and a young man invite you to their home, that's different. But in general, if it's something that feels right, in most cases, it is really right. People just like, I used to do it when I was even a kid. I would 13, 14-year old, and I'll meet tourists outside my school and I'll invite them to come to my home. And a few times a few came and my mom would cook for them. And I did it because I wanted to learn English. So you'll see so much of that. People are just extremely generous and hospitable. So the whole region, I would say, is the same. And even within Israel, there are different communities that you'll feel the same. So we can't think of one group in Israel, but there is, you have the Druze community, also very generous. You have the Cherkess community, amazing community that often people don't go necessarily to visit. You have the Ethiopian Jewish community. You have the Mizrahi Jewish community. And so try to connect to more than just whatever the main narrative, even within Israel.
Maybe a very ignorant question. Again, European don't know much, but everything you're describing, how's that against the US passport holders?
How is that what?
Against US citizens who have a US passport, are they just able as free to go in like any other tourist?
Yes. Yeah. US citizens can travel across the whole country, no problem. The only place you can't go to is Gaza Strip. That's literally impossible.
So everything you said, pretty much like going to people's houses, that would also apply if you have a US pass. Again, I don't know, so I'm just asking.
Yes.
Cool.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
So, but it all changes if you're an Israeli passport holder. That's what you're saying, right?
If you are an Israeli passport holder, you are local, and that limits your ability legally to travel. Or if you're a Palestinian ID holder, that limits your ability to travel.
Interesting. Do you think at any point, well, probably not because of the conflicts and everything, so maybe ignorant question. So let's move on then. I had a question regarding the other conflict. So at what point did you decide, okay, this is working here in Palestine, Israel? At what point did you start looking towards other countries? What was the first country you rolled out that you thought, hey, this is an interesting conflict to deal with? Well, interesting, well, that you can help with. Yeah, that's the question.
So from early on, we wanted to grow, but we didn't have the capacity to grow to other places. So the easiest was to grow locally. So if you're already traveling to Israel and Palestine, you might want to go to Jordan or Egypt. But we wanted to create a product, and there's no dual narratives necessarily in both of these countries. There's no like Israel Palestine defined, and that forced us to rethink how do we create this in those kind of places. So Jordan, there are so many voices. I think what we realized, there are so many voices that are not heard when you go to Jordan. You might go to Petra, but have you really spent time with the Bedouin community there? And so we start working with the Bedouin community, being able to visit them, hearing somebody who will tell their story, what does it mean to live as a Bedouin, not from the tour guide, which is often the case, but from the people themselves. So we did that. Then with the Syrian refugees, we started meeting with refugees and going to their home as well and hearing their stories. And so we started looking for what stories are missing and adding those in and making our trip to Jordan different. And the same in Egypt. Going to meet the Copt community and the Christian community there, going to innovation, learning about innovation like Garbage City, which has one of the best ratio for recycling on earth in the world. Over 85% of the garbage they collect is recycled. Small factories, small workshops in a very poor neighborhood, but it's doing more ecological work than big factories all over Europe and the US. So we started going to this recycling place and learning about that community, which is actually a Christian community. Going to visit the Arab League, learning about diplomacy and Egypt's role in diplomacy. Having lunches or dinners with local families, meeting with an archaeologist, meeting with the Nubians, the Black Egyptians, I guess, in the south, meeting with a Sufi, going to a couple of shows, adding all these things that most tours to Egypt are archaeology focused. Pyramids, Luxor, Aswan. And I love archaeology, but after 4 days of hearing about the pharaohs and what they did and hieroglyphy and all of that, I'm like, I would like a break. I want to learn about Coptic Egypt. I want to learn about Islamic Egypt. I want to learn about modern Egypt. I want to learn about who lives in this place. And that's too often missing. So we try to find those stories. So we went to Egypt. And then when we grew outside that to another kind of area that's similar to Israel, Palestine, Northern Ireland, it was just so simple to replicate what we're doing in Israel and Palestine to Northern Ireland, because you have the Catholic, Protestant, nationalist, unionist, and I love the region. Actually, it has the Israeli-Palestinian conflict involved in there. People feel either pro-Palestine or pro-Israel, depending on which side you are. Catholics are more likely to be pro-Palestine, Protestants more likely to be pro-Israel in Northern Ireland. So it actually kind of brings that elements with it. Then we started going, and that was about 5 years ago when we started there, and slowly start going to other places around Europe. I think issues of, like in France, issues of migration, issues of the different communities that live in Paris, the Africans, the Arab Africans, the North African groups, how do you live around those communities, what's their life is like, going to visit them. So starting to find whatever is missing. Then we came to Latin America just in the last couple of years. Colombia, Chile. Colombia, we're learning about the FARC, we're learning about social justice issues, we meet with former gang people. I think 3-4 years ago, we started doing Cambodia, Vietnam. Vietnam, by the way, is one of, I don't know if you've been, but one of my favorite places on earth. I went, spent a lot of time there to develop our trips there, found former fighters who fought in the war, the Vietnam-American War. Found the first guy who downed an American plane in the war. He was trained in Russia, came back and was able to do that. Became friends with the guy he brought down his plane. He survived. And then he was shot down. And he became friends with the guy who shot him down, an American pilot. And so we meet with him, we meet with historians, we go have a lot of connections with just different families while we are there. Learn about the green movement that is happening there, environmental movement that is amazing. Learn about conservation. Learn about it's just such an incredible country that I've been back, I think, 4 or 5 times, and I still would like to go back again, which is one thing I have. Unlike, I think sometimes people think I want to stamp as many passports, as many stamps on my passport, so I can say I've been to so many countries. I like to go back to the same place again and again and again, because the more you go back, the more connections you have and the more friends you have, and then you just fall in love with that place. So yeah, slowly we continue growing, not only into conflict areas, but into areas where we feel there are stories that are missing. And that's important, because I was in an accelerator once, and we didn't win the whatever prize. And the reason, I was told by an English guy who was the judge, he said, your model doesn't work except in Israel and Palestine. It cannot work anywhere else. And then he said, I live in London. We don't have different narratives in London. And I still boggled at that concept, because I've been to London. And I run tours in London. There are so many narratives in London. There are so many conflicts within the same city in London. There are so many communities that, going to London, going to Big Ben and going to all these, nice places is cool. But there's an amazing cultural diversity there that I would argue majority of tours ignore. Those kind of cultural diversity, the different groups that live there, how they ended up there, how did the Indian community ended up in London, how did the Arab community ended up in London, how did the Polish community ended up in London, what is happening with Brexit in the UK. There are so many things you can talk about. Actually, there's a beautiful small company there that are run by former and current homeless people who give tours of London from a different perspective. Not a poverty kind of tourism, not just about what does it feel like to be poor or homeless in London, but they give a perspective. They become real tour guides. And part of it is social justice, but part of it is a normal London tour, but not through the eyes of a privileged person. And it's an amazing tour that we love booking whenever we're running a tour in London with them. So there's so many of these that can exist in any city, not only in conflict zone. Is just by asking ourselves, am I hearing all the voices in the country or in the city I'm visiting? Or am I just hearing the dominant narratives, the dominant voices?
How do you develop those programs? Because obviously in the company, you develop those programs. So, I mean, I keep hearing you travel there, but it sounds like you're meeting these exclusive people, or like, how does this happen? Like, can you give an example? Considering the time and everything, I really want to cover the Democrat-Republican one. So can you give the example of the Democrat-Republican one? Like, what do you do? Do you travel to like Texas
I'll start
or
with the
something?
Balkan one, and I'll go to the Republican Democrat, because that's also recent and started 2 years ago. So because I come from a conflict resolution background and a little bit of journalism background, I have this amazing network. So I wanted to start trips in the Balkans. I've never been there, but when I was at TED, I met with an amazing photojournalist who is one of the most famous in Bosnia. His name is Zia Gafic. And Zia is from Bosnia. He doesn't work in tourism, never really done any tourism stuff. I called him and I said, Zia, I want to run tours in Bosnia. I want to run tours in Serbia. I want to run tours in Croatia. You're the only person really I know in this region. Can you help me? And he invited me over. So I traveled to there. He introduced me to literally everyone, from generals who fought in the war in Bosnia to the Sufi community there, to tour guides there, and then we don't only hire tour guides who study tour guides, we hire experts like him. So I asked him if he would be willing to be one of the leaders of our tours there. And slowly we put together this unbelievable trip. And then he put me in touch with a journalist in Serbia So I flew to Belgrade. I met with that journalist. Same thing. This is a guy who covered Yugoslavia and the whole breaking of Yugoslavia. Like, this is his focus. So I spent a couple of weeks there, met with everyone he would introduce me to, and then did the same thing in Croatia. And by the end of it, the friendships and the connections and the people we were able to access were something normal tour companies would have a hard time accessing because they're not from that same background. And that's the same in the US. So when we started in Washington, D.C. So I talked to people who I've met through these networks of mine in doing, National Geographic headquarters is in Washington, D.C. So through my network with people from National Geographic, through the network of people with TED, through network of people that I met through my work in George Mason University, which is in Washington, I was able to find people who worked in all these major political think tanks, Congress people, staffers of Congress people. And suddenly my problem wasn't how do I get the right speakers. My problem was who do I keep out, because there's so many amazing connections that are willing to speak to our group, that who do I leave out. And then as we start doing it in New York, I did the same thing. I mean, I remember in New York, I did some work for National Geographic there. I met this person who was very politically active. I called her. She knew everyone. I had a student who once traveled on a tour I was in, and he became a politician in New York. He's became a Republican politician in New York. I called him. He connected me to the Republican side, and now we can run our tours in New York because we got both communities. So relationships is our way to do that. I go to people I know, people I've met, and I don't work in any country where I have zero connections, because unless I know someone there and I go and I know what kind of product and I know I can trust them, and then this way we bring them in. We're bringing experts who are not necessarily from the travel industry, because that's the hardest part for us. Booking hotels, honestly, is easy. You don't need a travel agency to do that for you. Finding a tour guide, finding a driver, that's easy. You don't need a tour company to do it. You can do it now online. It's so simple. There are so many websites to do it. But finding those kind of relationships and experiences, that's what we specialize in. And that's something it's very hard for you to do on your own. So we bring that added experience, that added value that I think many tour companies would have hard time necessarily finding those connections.
So it almost sounds like the connections you've built through your TED Talk, the National Geographic Network, I mean, these give you just almost like who can compete with that? That's such a valuable network.
Right. I'm very blessed for being part of those networks because, yeah, it just opened up a whole world for me that I wouldn't have had otherwise.
I really want to ask this question though. I know we're already coming on time, but National Geographic for me has been something that I grew up with watching, most iconic thing for me. How did you get involved? How did that even happen? When did it happen?
So I became involved through something called the Emerging Explorers Network. And the Emerging Explorers Network is hard to get in because you can't apply for. There's somebody from National Geographic would have to have nominated you to, and then it goes through basically the whole organization, and people vote on all the ones nominated, and then eventually 10, 15 people get chosen to become part of this network. And it's great because it's a network, it's a relationship that's not just for 1 year, it's a relationship that can last for a lifelong. You get relationship access to the organization. I got an email that told me, congratulations, you have become a National Geographic Explorer. Send us your bank account number. We're sending you some money. And I thought, this is one of those, fake emails trying to steal my money. Yeah, right. So I deleted it.
No
I got another
way.
email 2 days later. Same thing. Have you received our email? I'm like, these people really want my money and I don't have much, so no. And I kept deleting their emails. And then I got a phone call and they're like, have you been receiving our emails from National Geographic about becoming an explorer? And my response was like, oh, that's real? And they're like, yeah, do you want it or not? I'm like, yeah, I want it. What do you mean not? So I found out later that this happened through my travels, because on one of the tours, one of the first tours that I've run, and I was on the tour, one of the people on the tour worked for National Geographic. And so she put my name. She loved the tour. She was amazed by the whole dual narrative aspect, the concept. And so she suggested me, and it went through the organization, and I got in, which is incredible because I don't deal with a lot of the things necessarily National Geographic sometimes deal with. I come a little bit from a different perspective, and it takes. I was very grateful, and it says a lot about the organization going for someone like me, who's coming maybe at things a bit differently. And since then, I've done a lot of projects with Nat Geo, including writing some stuff for them. I hosted a web show about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. You can find on YouTube, called Conflict Zone, which shows the different narratives of Israel-Palestine, 4 episodes. We do travel for them. We run some of we are the operator for some of their trips. So this partnership has been going on for now 10 years, and hopefully for many more years.
What does your job entail for them? Or is it a title?
It's not a job in the sense you don't get a salary, a job, but it's a relationship where you can come and propose ideas, and it will go to the right people within the organization. And if there is synergy, then that would happen. If not, then you propose a different idea. So I do, for example, I'm an expert on travel for them. I join sometimes some of their trips as an expert, and that's a contract, a paid job that I'll go for 10 days on a trip where I get paid to be an expert, Nat Geo expert, and that tour. So that's one example of a project. I proposed to them this conflict zone thing, and I was hired to do that show as a producer and host of it. So it's really depends. One of my favorite projects I did with them was a photography project with refugee kids in Syria. I did a lot of work there, and I was taking photos of all these kids and talking to them and showing their photos, telling the story of refugees. And I did get consent from the families, just to be clear. But I felt that was missing something. And so I came back to National Geographic. They have a program called Photo Camp, which sends some of the best photographers in the world, magazine photographers, to a place and teaches, and they teach photography. And so I had the photographers like Amy Thompson and Matt Moyer, who are magazine photographers. They came to Jordan, met with Syrian refugee kids with me, 13-year-old kids. We taught them photography, and then had them go and do their photos. And those photos were used in magazines. Some Nat Geo magazines told the story through the photos that the kids took. And it was exhibited in maybe one of the most famous places to exhibit in the United States, at the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C. Those photos were exhibited, telling the stories as the kids told it. So it wasn't photos we took, it was all photos these refugee kids took of their life. And it's extremely powerful because it wasn't about poverty, it wasn't about the tent they lived in. It was mostly about their life. It was about the loved ones, photos of them hugging each other, photos of their sister or brother, photos of them playing football, those things that they really wanted to show the world. And that was so powerful.
It sounds like almost like that English guy was wrong. Somebody who does a tour guide and then is also an explorer for National Geographic seems like the perfect combination.
I would say he was wrong, but you can't convince everyone always, and that's fine. You can't. It's all right. If it wasn't the right time and the right place, it wasn't the right time and the right place.
We're coming to the end. I want to ask a last question, which is related to Impact Talks, our podcast, and it's about an impact story from you, which is what is the project that you worked on that had the biggest impact?
Phew, that's hard to ask because I worked on a lot of projects that have an
The
impact.
one that stands out for you, maybe a learning lesson relevant to maybe our audience.
Well, obviously, the travel, that's one of the most impact I've had, but maybe I'll go for something different since we talked a lot about travel. Um, I've been doing a lot of work actually also through National Geographic with teachers. And kind of the same concept of bringing conflict resolution into travel, I wanted to take conflict resolution into education. And it's not easy to do that because changing, adding, whatever, meeting with teachers isn't easy. And I'm very grateful because National Geographic Learning has helped me put me in front of thousands of teachers in the last few years. Uh, Almost before the pandemic, every month or two, I would travel to a different place, meet with hundreds of teachers, talk about conflict resolution in classroom, how conflict resolution is important in classroom, how do you do it, what kind of ideas teachers can use, what kind of tools teachers can use, telling my story really, doing it through my stories and how education was what changed me, especially language education, and talking about how language or any education can really be a powerful tool to to help kids understand how to solve problems. And so in the last 6 years I've been doing this, and through it I have met easily, I have talked to 15,000 teachers at least from all over the world, Latin America, Europe, Asia, mostly Latin America, which has become my favorite continent as I was doing this work. And I feel it has a lot of impact because if you impact only a few teachers, you are impacting thousands of students. And so that's one of my favorite projects I have worked on in addition to my travel work.
I really like that last thing that you said. By impacting teachers, you also impact all of their students. That's definitely very powerful. I want to roll out the red carpet for you. Do you have anything to promote, anything to share? Where can people find you?
Yes, thank you. So I would, wow, there's so much I can talk about here, but let's go with MEJDI. I think this has been a really difficult year for us, for any travel business. And so if you check out, we put out a lot of tours right now that are available for people to join. If you go to mejditours.com, MEJDI is M as in Mary, EJD as in David, tours.com, and join a tour. You'll find tons of tours. We customize tours for organizations, families, smaller groups, or you can join an open tour that's going to any of the places there. We adding more tours literally every day in the next 2-3 weeks. So that would be one. I'll add one more thing that I actually forgot to even mention. One organization I helped co-start is going to be hosting on, I believe, the 30th of September, a major project in New York that would be also telling different narratives. So if you're in New York on the 30th of September, we're going to be putting on statues of 5 people, a Muslim, a Jew, a refugee, a Latino. I think it's like these heroes who have protected someone from a different community. We call it I'm Your Protector. And so it's going to be a big event happening in New York. If you're there, please come check it out again. IamYourProtector.org. Fascinating project, one of my favorite that I've worked on. So these are the main 2 projects I would like to promote.
After the 30th of September, you should maybe pop by again so that we can question you about that. um, I want to, last question, anything you want to share, last words towards the audience?
Absolutely. So one of my favorite stories come from an Israeli author named Amos Oz. And Amos Oz says, if you are walking by a building and you find out this building is catching on fire, what would you do? And he says, you have 3 options of what you would do. The first one is you run away. And as we look around us, there are many problems in this world. And it's like the world is catching on fire. Here a little bit, there a little bit, Israel, Palestine, Colombia, Venezuela. And it's very easy for us to say that's thousands of miles away from me, that's not my problem, I run away. But the truth is, fire catches on, and even from a selfish point of view, it will eventually get to your house. It keeps moving and it doesn't stay where it is. So that's the first option. The second option, he said, you create a committee to investigate who should we blame for this fire. And by the time you decide who to blame for the fire, everybody in that building would be dead. So you didn't help. And that we do as well a lot. We feel if I tweeted about, Syria, I blame this for what happened there. Israel, Palestine, I blame this for what's happening. That doesn't make a change. That's not actually activism. Blaming isn't activism, and we have to remember that. And I think in this world we live in today, we think that if I just say I blame so-and-so for this fire, then I did my part without trying to help those in the fire. And then he said the third option, you get a cup, you fill it with water, and you throw it on the fire. But what if you don't have a cup? Well, he started actually with a bucket. You get a bucket, you fill it with water, you throw it in the fire. And if you don't have a bucket, you get a cup, you fill it with water, and you throw it in the fire. But then what if you don't have a cup? You get a spoon, you fill it with water, and you throw it in the fire. And then he says, would one person with a spoon be able to put out a fire? And the answer is no. None on our own would be able to put out the fire. But the thing is, if each one of us thinks, I can't, then no one would. If every one of us thinks, do I have a bucket? Do I have a cup? Do I have a spoon? Can I spit even on the fire? I don't know what your capacity is, but if we can think, what is my capacity? And every one of us takes whatever they have to put out the fire, then that fire will be put out if we work together. Don't think of, I can't make it happen because I only have a spoon. Think just, what is it that I can do to make a small difference? It might be telling a story. It might be visiting someone. It might be making a friend that is not somebody who looks like you. It might be something, depending on what the issues you are dealing with, which fire you're trying to put out, there's something you can do. And that's my mission, is trying to inspire people to think not of what's wrong in the world, but to inspire them to think, what is my spoon? What is my cup? What is my bucket? What is it that I can do to put out the fire? And I hope after these 2 hours of our conversation, everyone can think of, take some time and think, what's my spoon?
I think that's a very inspiring words to close it on. I really want to thank you for being on Impact Talks, and hope to see you soon on another one as well.
Thank you. And look forward to, I'll be reaching out to you about your offer that you made earlier. So we'll be definitely in touch.
If you liked this episode, you can check out our most recent one here. And if you haven't already, make sure you click here to subscribe and see the next one. But if you're interested in more tips and tricks, then make sure to join our Facebook group, where you can find thousands of like-minded people and you get direct access and support to any business